So I did a video the other day where in response to Donald Trump's comments about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, I did a video talking about this question of whether or not, first of all, what the origins and rationale was of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and whether or not Trump was right to basically praise or at least apologize for the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And in response to that video, a reader asked me, he said, quote, "Was it the Muslim Brotherhood faction from Cairo who took power after the Soviet withdrawal and blew up those ancient Buddhist statues, etc.?" He's referring here to the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhists and Taliban. And then he continues, "Also, what the heck is the difference between the Mujahideen and the Taliban? Sunni versus Shia? Question mark." So I want to address this question here about the origins of the Taliban, but I also want to use this as a segue to talk about a more general question, which is how this sectarian divide in the Middle East between Sunnis and Shia has shaped and influenced U.S. foreign policy over the last few decades. So the important thing to think about is that the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the U.S. response to it really comes about in the backdrop and in the immediate aftermath of the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And this is just an enormous moment for the U.S. and really a defining moment, because up until the point, Iran, being under the leadership of the Shah, really had been a pillar and a cornerstone of what the U.S. was trying to do in the Middle East. It was a critical U.S. ally in the Middle East. Now, basically overnight, Iran goes from being this reliable, friendly U.S. ally to a regime that people did not think was really possible, which was a full-fledged Shia revolution and now an Islamic State being governed by mullahs. I mean, it's important to remember here that even insofar as Ayatollah Khomeini was known, people doubted really right until the revolution happened and he took power that he'd actually be able to consolidate this Islamic government. But he does, and by the early 80s, it's clear that this is a new order in the Middle East. And now there's an obvious concern that what happened in Iran could really press much more dangerous dynamics throughout the region. Now, so what happens basically with the Iranian Revolution now is that the closest U.S. allies in the region now are all Sunni-dominated governments. There's Saudi Arabia, obviously, Egypt, which is getting consolidated under Hosni Mubarak, and then also Pakistan is a reliable U.S. ally under military dictatorship. The problem for the U.S. is basically now that its fate is tied with Sunni governments in the region at precisely a moment where Sunni Islamism and Sunni radicalism is on the rise. Now, how is this happening? When the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan happens, this Afghan cause becomes a unifying point, a rallying point for Islamist forces everywhere, but predominantly in the Sunni world. So under Egypt, you have in reaction to the secular dictatorship there, a growing faction of Sunni radicals coming to the fore, and they go off to Afghanistan to help the Mujahideen. Saudi Arabia is financing the Mujahideen and particularly the Islamist factions. And then Pakistan is also the major conduit and route through which the U.S. is basically arming the Mujahideen. But the problem is that because the U.S. does not really have a direct line to these Mujahideen fighters, the U.S. is sending all this aid to Pakistan, but specifically the Pakistani military and intelligence services, and then they're channeling their aid, their support, and so forth to the Islamist factions of the Afghan resistance, as opposed to the nationalist or royalist ones. And it's important to mention here a little bit that what's happening here in each of these countries. So what happens is basically in 1976, the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, promoted Zia al-Haq to be the army chief of staff, basically on the calculation that this young, devout general would be more pliant than his British-trained superiors. But Zia ends up being a surprise. The following year, he conspired with the ISI, the intelligence services in Pakistan, to orchestrate a coup. And he ended up toppling the civilian government and now is presiding over a military state. But Zia turned out to be a surprisingly revolutionary figure, because what he ended up doing, he was the son of a Sunni theologian, and he basically a project of transforming Pakistan from a moderate Islamic identity, the one that was influential at the founding of the country after the British left, into a much more fundamentalist Sunni state. So from embassies to the district level of governments to schools, Zia basically deployed an empowered military and intelligence service, and he basically tasked them with creating what he called a new Islamic order under Wahhabist law. And obviously, so as the Pakistani state is becoming more of a Sunni influenced country, the most kind of violent, virulent aspects of the Afghan resistance are now getting aid from Pakistan. Now, I mean, at the same time that this all this is happening in Afghanistan, the Iran-Iraq war also breaks out, and here this has the effect of basically driving the U.S. and the Sunni leadership in Iraq under Saddam Hussein closer together. Not because the U.S. particularly liked the Saddam Hussein regime, but there's a fear, and a legitimate fear, that the Iranian Revolution now could really spread to Iraq, which of course had a predominantly Shia population. So now you basically have here, so the fate of U.S. strategy in the Middle East now is basically in the hands now of these Sunni governments, all of which are problematic. Pakistan is undergoing a makeover, an Islamist makeover. Saudi Arabia, the monarchy there, is funneling Wahhabist factions in Afghanistan. The repressive secular government in Egypt is basically now fueling and inciting Muslim Brotherhood factions in Egypt, which are now gravitating to Afghanistan. And then the U.S. is now getting into bed with Iraq, specifically with the Saddam Hussein regime. So to answer this first question, what the Mujahideen basically were these, they were one component essentially of the Afghan resistance to the Soviet Union, but in this myriad of the many different factions in Afghanistan that were taking on the Soviet Union, the Mujahideen were the Islamist fighters. These were the almost entirely Sunni radicals who are leading the charge, and they're the ones who, they don't necessarily enjoy the most support in Afghanistan, but they're by far getting the most foreign backing from each of these international patrons, and indirectly from the U.S. It's important to remember here that how complementary and how positively the Reagan administration, and in particular Ronald Reagan himself, really viewed these guys as being freedom fighters, and he often compared them to the revolutionaries that founded the U.S. without much, or at least sufficient regard of how radical these guys were. Now, what ends up happening basically is that, as I talked about in the last video, the Soviets, to everyone's surprise, end up withdrawing from Afghanistan. The Soviet-installed government in Afghanistan actually survived longer than people thought, but ultimately it fell apart. And it gets overrun by these Mujahideen leaders who are now obviously very powerful and have a certain mandate. But these Mujahideen factions, once they actually have to govern, far from governing, I mean, their attempts to forge anything in the way of a serious government that can actually work falls apart, and Afghanistan just falls into a just really horrific civil war in the early to mid 90s. I mean, just total chaos, total destruction, far worse than anything the Soviets had done. Now, so this is where the Taliban comes in, and basically the precise origins of the Taliban remain somewhat murky and unclear. But the point is that basically they were branding themselves as being students of Islam. These were young people from Afghanistan, devout to be sure. But early on, it was not obvious that the Taliban would become this very Sunni fundamentalist force. They were calling early on that to allow the king of Afghanistan to return from exile. I talk about Zahir Shah in the last video. And you had people like Hamid Karzai initially favorable about the Taliban. You also had many Afghan watchers in the US look favorably on the Taliban as being these students of Islam who could come about, bring order to Afghanistan. Now, what ends up happening for reasons that are still unclear / debated is that, you know, whatever the precise origins are of the Taliban, they very quickly become basically a proxy of the Pakistani ISI and military services, which by the end of this period are now fully Islamist and promoting Islam in Afghanistan. Now, just a side note here, part of the reason why Pakistan is so keen on supporting these Sunni radicals in Afghanistan, beyond just what's happening within Pakistan itself, is that there have been long-standing border disputes between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And so seen from this border perspective and this territorial divide, the secular or at least relatively secular Afghan nationalists are actually more of a threat because they're more interested in these national boundaries than are these Islamists who ultimately are not interested in these national borders as much as they are in creating this unified caliphate that would transcend these artificial borders as they see it. Okay, so the Taliban is different from the Mujahideen in the sense that the Taliban are basically saying, look, these Mujahideen guys are, first of all, I mean, they're illegitimate. They've caused enormous destruction and chaos in Afghanistan, and these now with the backing of Pakistan, these Taliban are promising to bring order to Afghanistan. It's really only after they consolidate power in Afghanistan that it becomes clear just how radical they are, that they really set out to impose and implement this genuinely totalitarian Sunni government in Afghanistan, far more repressive than anything else we've seen in the region. Now, what's happening here is, you know, the Mujahideen sort of faction, so to speak, they're not completely out now, and one of the, I think, lingering sort of ideas or notions is basically that that there's this popular idea that, well, the 9/11 attacks represented this blowback from what we've done during the Soviet-Afghan War. And it's actually more complicated than that, because what ended up happening basically was that during this period where the basically, actually, I mean, throughout the 80s, but really in particular when the Taliban is coming to the fore and consolidating power in Afghanistan, there are these tensions between the Afghan fighters who are taking on the Soviets and the Arab fighters who are coming from out of the country. And there were constantly tensions between these outsider Arabs and the Taliban that are more indigenous force. Now, the Taliban and Al Qaeda, which ends up getting formed as a predominantly Sunni Arab faction or entity, they end up making common cause, but it's important to remember that they were always distinct. And what basically happened, I would argue, is that the these Afghan and Arab fighters sort of since the 80s were rivals. But what ended up happening was that when the Taliban took over Afghanistan, Al Qaeda now becomes this sort of stateless terrorist faction of predominantly Sunni Arabs, and they need a safe haven. And so what they do is that they basically come to the Taliban and they say, look, we need a safe haven. The Taliban's poor, is trying to sort of consolidate power over Afghanistan. And what Al Qaeda basically says is that we'll, in exchange for sanctuary in Afghanistan, we'll provide you with arms, with funding, et cetera. And unlike in most scenarios where state sponsors have money and resources that they provide to terrorist proxies, in many ways the opposite was happening here in Afghanistan, where Al Qaeda is actually wealthier. Al Qaeda has more foreign patrons. Al Qaeda has a more international makeup, and so they're, in exchange for the sanctuary here in Afghanistan, are providing support to the Taliban. Now, it happens, and now the U.S. basically realizes that all of these Sunni relationships that it had cultivated are basically coming back to haunt them, and now basically dependent on, has sort of tied its fate to each of these Sunni factions or Sunni governments in the region, all of which are not only problematic morally and from a humanitarian standpoint, but they're now being shown actually not to be purveyors of stability in the Middle East, far from it. And there's a sense, obviously, Iran remains a adversary of the U.S., but it has, by the time the 9/11 attacks happened, it has moderated to some degree. A lot of the revolutionary fire that animated the Iranian regime in the years right after '79 have gone. And there's a sense that the Iranian problem is more manageable. Now, one of the things that, in thinking about why does the U.S. end up after 9/11 in Iraq, there were a lot of reasons, obviously, that were offered. I think the predominant reason, the main reason why the U.S. went in was what they said they went in for, which was a perceived threat of the nexus between kind of the Saddam Hussein regime and WMD programs and this broader sort of foment or in the Middle East. But I think why the Bush administration, not only the Bush administration, but I think the U.S. foreign policy establishment generally believed that it could invade Iraq, topple Iraq, and ultimately get to a Middle Eastern order that might be more conducive to its interests, was because of this idea or this notion that the U.S. had bet the farm on Sunni leadership and had now paid the price in a devastating way. And there's a lot of truth, I think, to this argument. So you think about the fact that the U.S. ended up backing these guys in the Mujahideen. They failed miserably in Afghanistan. Egypt and Saudi Arabia, which had remained allies of the U.S., nevertheless are so unresponsive to their own people that they're basically inciting and inspiring radicalism that manifested in the form of Al-Qaeda. The Sunni regime in Iraq under Saddam Hussein, which was supposed to be a bulwark of stability against Iranian Shia radicalism, in fact becomes its own far more serious problem when Iraq invaded Kuwait in '91 and then basically produced a miserable time throughout the '90s where the U.S. had to spend an enormous amount of energy and effort containing Iraq. And so the idea becomes that, well, maybe if we topple the Saddam Hussein regime, and we try to promote democracy in Iraq, one of the consequences of promoting democracy in Iraq, in addition to the fact that there may just be more enlightened leadership in Iraq, is the fact that Iraq would basically overnight be transformed into a Sunni majority country. A Shia majority country. But this Shia majority country would be different from what was in Iran, because one, the U.S. would be shepherding and spearheading it, but two, because the Iraqi Shia were Arabs. They weren't. They were Shia Arabs, not Shia Persians, and they had proven in the Iran-Iraq war that whatever sort of sympathy they might have with their compatriots in Iran, that they had fought at the end of the day loyally as Iraqis against their Shia brethren in Iran. So the idea was basically that by invading Iraq, by promoting new leadership there, that what could arise in Iraq was a democracy in Iraq run by Shia Arabs that would basically give the U.S. a new set of allies in the Middle East that were different and distinct and hopefully more enlightened from the cesspool of Sunni politics in the Middle East, us into so much trouble. Now, this calculation obviously does not work for a variety of reasons, and I think that it had a lasting impact on U.S. foreign policy in the present day. One manifestation of that, for example, was during the so-called Arab Spring, the Arab upheaval. There was a fairly serious movement, a grassroots movement that had come about to challenge the Sunni monarchy in Bahrain, and it looked like there was a chance that the Shia majority in Bahrain could actually take over and allow the Shia to come to power. If my understanding is basically that the U.S. Gave the monarchy in Bahrain carte blanche to crack down violently against the Shia without raising too much of a fuss. And I think the basic thinking here was that in this region where there is so much chaos, the only thing that the U.S. really has left with some semblance of stability here are these monarchies in the region. I mean, I think had Iraq turned out better, had the Shia leadership in Iraq proven that it could govern in the way the U.S. would have liked, I suspect that U.S. thinking in places like Bahrain and elsewhere would have been different. I think where we are now and where U.S. thinking is now is basically that we've come to recognize just instability generally as being the most serious problem and threat facing the Middle East and U.S. interests. This is obviously true in spades in Syria, which has really now become the main, I would argue, epicenter of Middle Eastern chaos. And I think many of these romantic notions that we can count on any particular Sunni or Shia faction to do our bidding is basically gone. I think at this point the U.S. is ready to live with whatever forces of stability it can. I think the one possible exception is that the Kurds have emerged as being the closest thing to a genuine, serious ally of the U.S., but no one's under the illusions that the Kurds can really lay down a new order in the Middle East that is sustainable. So that's sort of where the U.S. is, and I think that many of these, I suppose the good news, if there is such a thing right now in the Middle East, is that much of the radicalism, much of the fanaticism, much of the Islamism that we now have a tendency to take for granted or view as a given, it's important to remember that it wasn't too long ago that these Islamist factions and Islamic radicalism was not anywhere near the force that it is today. It came about at a very particular time, at a particular place for a variety of reasons. And if there could be a Middle East without these kinds of factions. There can certainly be a Middle East afterwards. And the question simply is whether or not new leadership, whether reform can come from within, whether new movements can reform, whether they can find new forms of meaning and identity, maybe in nationalism, maybe in liberalism, maybe in something else. I think that if I were to make a prediction, I think probably the most promising source of reform in the Middle East may actually come from the women of the region who across the board have not really kept up with the rest of the world. And I think if you were to see throughout the region women playing more of a role throughout the Middle East, it's hard to predict how that would turn out, but I have to think that it would dampen some of the radicalism and extremism that has plagued the region.